Battle of Verdun 1916. February 21st, 1916. Before dawn breaks over northeastern France, more than 1,000 German artillery pieces erupt in unison, unleashing an overwhelming storm of fire upon the French defenses surrounding the fortress city of Verdun. The thunder of exploding shells marks the beginning of what will become one of the deadliest and most iconic battles of the First World War. Verdun is far more than another military engagement. It is where traditional battlefield strategy gives way to a far darker philosophy, the brutal mathematics of attrition. The objective is no longer to outmaneuver the enemy or capture vast territories. Instead, victory is measured by one simple calculation: destroy the enemy's army faster than your own is destroyed. Bleed your opponent until his will to fight collapses. The theory sounds cold and logical. The reality is unimaginable. For nearly 10 months, Verdun will become an industrial-scale killing ground where around 1,000 soldiers lose their lives every single day. Entire landscapes are reduced to lifeless wastelands, and generations of young men vanish into mud, smoke, and shattered earth. Yet Verdun is more than a story of unimaginable suffering. It is also a story of extraordinary leadership, relentless determination, and incredible acts of courage. It is a battlefield where new weapons reshape warfare, military doctrines evolve under fire, and ordinary soldiers display remarkable resilience against impossible odds. This is the story of the Battle of Verdun. 2 months have passed since the opening German offensive. By April 1916, the battle has transformed exactly as German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn intended into a merciless war of attrition. Instead of one decisive breakthrough, countless smaller battles rage across ravines, wooded hillsides, shattered trenches, and every patch of elevated ground. Each ridge, hill, and ruined position becomes fiercely contested because whoever controls the high ground gains one invaluable advantage: the ability to direct artillery fire with devastating precision. Throughout the First World War, artillery is the true master of the battlefield. Long before infantry ever see one another, enormous guns bombard enemy positions with high explosive and shrapnel shells. Artillery accounts for more casualties than any other weapon used during the conflict. During just the first 6 months of the Battle of Verdun, historians estimate that nearly 37 million shells are fired. By the battle's conclusion, that figure may exceed 100 million. Among Germany's most terrifying weapons are the colossal 420mm howitzers, including the massive Gamma Mixer and the legendary siege gun known to the Allies as Big Bertha. Only 22 of these enormous artillery pieces are ever constructed. 13 are deployed against Verdun. Each Big Bertha weighs more than 43 metric tons and carries a barrel over 16 feet long. Every shell weighs well over a metric ton and can travel nearly 6 miles before crashing onto its target. Designed to destroy fortifications, these shells follow a steep trajectory before plunging into the ground. Delayed action fuses allow them to penetrate as much as 40 feet of reinforced earth and concrete before detonating with catastrophic force. Operating one of these monsters requires a crew of around 240 men. Preparing a single gun for combat is a massive engineering operation, yet once assembled, it can fire only about 8 shells per hour. To avoid being caught in the blast should a shell explode inside the barrel, crews ignite the weapon using a long firing cord. Even when everything functions perfectly, the concussion is so immense that windows can shatter nearly 2 miles away. During the opening stages of the campaign, French artillery struggles to match this overwhelming firepower. General Philippe Pétain quickly recognizes that success depends on strengthening Verdun's defenses with every available heavy gun. Among the weapons rushed to the front is the aging 155mm Dobonga cannon, first introduced in the 1870s. Although considered outdated compared to the famous and highly mobile French 75, the old guns proved surprisingly valuable. Stationed within permanent defensive positions around Verdun, the Dobonga cannons provide reliable long-range support throughout the campaign. Improved versions fitted with stronger metal wheels offer greater mobility across rough terrain. while their lighter shells can actually outrange many of Germany's heavier weapons, reaching nearly 8 miles. Even more importantly, experienced French gun crews achieve remarkable accuracy. Specializing in counter-battery fire, they systematically locate and destroy German artillery positions, reducing the enemy's overwhelming advantage. For the soldiers trapped beneath the endless shell fire, life at Verdun becomes almost impossible to imagine. Enemy infantry are rarely visible. Instead, death arrives from the sky without warning. The battlefield is littered with shattered bodies, broken equipment, and the remains of men who can no longer be buried. The smell of decay hangs permanently over the scarred landscape. Constant bombardment destroys trenches almost as quickly as they are dug. Instead of organized defensive lines, soldiers shelter inside shell craters connected by narrow paths hastily carved through the mud. Those fortunate enough to reach Verdun's battered forts discover at least some protection from the relentless bombardment, along with precious medical aid stations. Ironically, several forts that French commanders had once considered obsolete, including the mighty Fort Douaumont, prove remarkably resilient against Germany's heaviest artillery. Even so, soldiers on both sides endure constant fear, exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Streams are polluted. Village wells have been destroyed. Disease spreads rapidly among exhausted men living under unbearable conditions. General Pétain understands that no army can survive such punishment indefinitely. To preserve both morale and combat effectiveness, he introduces a systematic rotation policy known as Noria, named after a traditional water wheel. French units are regularly withdrawn from the front line, allowing exhausted soldiers to rest before returning to battle. The system prevents complete physical and psychological collapse and eventually means that nearly 3/4 of the entire French army will serve at Verdun at some point during the campaign. For many veterans, one simple phrase becomes a lifelong badge of honor: J'ai fait Verdun. I was at Verdun. The German army adopts no comparable rotation system. Many German formations remain in the front line for extended periods, suffering steadily increasing casualties while exhaustion and morale deteriorate with each passing week. Meanwhile, Pétain pays just as much attention to logistics as he does to tactics. South of Verdun, a single supply route becomes the lifeline of the entire French defense. Day and night, an endless procession of trucks carries reinforcements, ammunition, food, and medical supplies toward the battlefield. The road earns a legendary name, La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Every day, approximately 15,000 soldiers and 15,000 tons of supplies travel along this vital artery. Military trucks pass one another every few seconds without pause. Any vehicle that breaks down is immediately pushed aside to prevent traffic from stopping. More than 10,000 laborers work continuously to repair and maintain the road under constant pressure. Without the Sacred Way, Verdun could never have been defended. As spring progresses, however, the cost of the battle continues to rise. By April, German casualties have already exceeded 100,000 men, causing Falkenhayn to question whether the offensive should continue. Despite mounting losses, the struggle is far from over. The Battle of Verdun is only entering its most brutal phase. As the spring of 1916 wears on, the German high command grows increasingly uneasy. What was expected to be a calculated campaign of attrition has already consumed an astonishing number of lives. By April, German casualties have exceeded 100,000 men, forcing Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn to briefly consider ending the offensive altogether. But the battle continues. On May 8th, tragedy strikes the German garrison occupying Fort Douaumont. Deep inside the captured fortress, an ammunition depot suddenly catches fire. Within moments, flames race through the narrow underground passages, igniting explosives and filling the tunnels with smoke. Nearly 700 German soldiers perish in one of the deadliest accidents of the entire campaign. Yet despite this disaster, German forces continue to grind forward. After weeks of relentless fighting, they finally capture two of the most fiercely contested positions on the western bank of the Meuse River, K 304 and Le Mort Alme. Known in English as Dead Man's Hill, these shattered hills dominate the surrounding terrain, making them invaluable observation posts for artillery. Every meter of ground is purchased with blood. While the Germans slowly advance, General Philippe Pétain remains committed to a disciplined defensive strategy. Rather than launching reckless counterattacks, he carefully preserves his troops, ensuring every position is defended only when it offers genuine military value. His calm leadership earns widespread admiration, and before long he is promoted to command the entire French Central Army Group. His successor at Verdun is General Robert Neville. Unlike Pétain, Neville firmly believes in the traditional French doctrine of the offensive. He has little interest in simply containing the German advance. He intends to strike back. The French have already attempted once to recapture Fort Douaumont, but the effort ended in failure. On May 22nd, Neville orders a second assault. After an intense artillery bombardment, French infantry surged toward the massive fortress. Despite devastating casualties, one regiment successfully fights its way inside. For a brief moment, victory appears possible. Then German artillery isolates the attackers, cutting them off from reinforcements while powerful counterattacks seal every escape route. Surrounded, exhausted, and running out of ammunition, roughly 1,000 surviving French soldiers are forced to surrender. The entire attacking division suffers nearly 50% casualties, making the operation another costly failure. Meanwhile, Falkenhayn receives optimistic intelligence reports suggesting that France has already lost 500,000 men, supposedly suffering 3 or 4 casualties for every German soldier killed. The figures are wildly inaccurate. In reality, casualties on both sides remain remarkably similar. But believing that his strategy is finally succeeding, Falkenhayn authorizes another major offensive. His next objective is Fort Vaux. Although smaller than Douaumont, the fortress overlooks important German supply routes and remains a critical pillar of the French defensive network. Following a week of bitter fighting through shattered valleys and cratered terrain, German infantry reached the fort on June 2, 1916. Inside, approximately 500 French defenders retreat into the maze of underground tunnels. What follows is one of the most desperate sieges of the First World War. German troops employ flamethrowers and poison gas to force their way through the narrow corridors. Hand-to-hand combat erupts in complete darkness as soldiers fight with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and even bare hands. For 5 agonizing days, the garrison refuses to surrender. But courage alone cannot overcome thirst. The defenders eventually exhaust their water supply. Weak, dehydrated, and physically broken, they finally lay down their arms. Fort Vaux falls into German hands, but only after a heroic defense that earns lasting respect from friend and foe alike. The German offensive now turns toward a chain of strategic positions stretching from Piedmont through the ruined village of Fleury and onward to Fort Souville. These heights represent the final line protecting Verdun itself. If Souville falls, nothing substantial remains between the German army and the city beyond. Determined to break French resistance once and for all, the Germans introduce an even deadlier weapon. On June 22nd, their artillery launches more than 100,000 gas shells across the sector. Instead of chlorine, many of these shells contain phosgene and diphosgene, new chemical agents significantly more lethal than earlier battlefield gases. French gas masks provide only limited protection. Artillery crews struggle to breathe as the invisible poison fills gun positions, trenches, shell craters, and wooded ravines. Heavy concentrations of gas remain trapped in low ground long after the bombardment ends, making it nearly impossible to move reinforcements or ammunition to the front. Many French batteries simply fall silent. At dawn the following day, German infantry attack. They rapidly seize the fortified position at Piedmont before overrunning the shattered village of Fleury. During the coming weeks, Fleury will change hands 16 separate times, becoming one of the most bitterly contested locations of the entire battle. The German army now stands barely 4 miles from Verdun. It is the closest they will ever come. Recognizing the gravity of the moment, General Neville sends an inspiring message throughout the French army. ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. The word spread rapidly from trench to trench. French troops hold their ground at Froidetière and continue defending Fort Souville, the final fortress protecting Verdun. The German advance has reached its absolute limit. Although neither side realizes it yet, the tide of the battle is beginning to turn. By the summer of 1916, the Battle of Verdun has already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Neither army has achieved the decisive breakthrough it desperately seeks. Instead, the battlefield has become a relentless contest of endurance, where every attack demands an unbearable price. Then, in July 1916, events elsewhere on the Western Front begin to reshape the struggle. Far to the northwest, along the river, some British and French forces launch a massive offensive against German positions. The assault has been planned for months, but one of its most urgent objectives is now clear: to relieve the crushing pressure on Verdun. Germany is forced to divert men, artillery, and supplies to confront the new threat. For the first time in months, the relentless pressure on Verdun begins to ease. Even so, the cost of the campaign continues to provoke fierce criticism inside Germany. Many officers question Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn's strategy. His promise that France would bleed to death at Verdun has not materialized. Instead, both armies have suffered catastrophic losses while the front line has barely moved. In August 1916, Falkenhayn is removed from command. He is replaced by the celebrated Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, whose reputation has been forged on the Eastern Front. One of Hindenburg's first decisions is to halt all major offensive operations at Verdun. After months of continuous attacks, the battlefield finally grows quieter, but only temporarily. By October 1916, the immediate German threat to Verdun has diminished dramatically. Now the initiative belongs to France. General Robert Neville, confident and determined, believes the time has come not merely to defend Verdun, but to reclaim every fortress and every piece of ground that had been lost earlier in the year. For him, it is more than a military necessity. It is a matter of national honor. On October 21st, approximately 650 French artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The bombardment is unlike anything seen earlier in the campaign. Among the guns are two enormous 400mm railway cannons, proudly named Alsace and Lorraine after the provinces seized by Germany following the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. Their mission is simple: destroy the forts that Germany had spent months fighting to capture. For 2 relentless days, gigantic shells crash into German positions. Fort Douaumont is struck repeatedly. Several shells smash through its reinforced concrete roof, collapsing underground passages and detonating ammunition stores deep within the fortress. Even structures once believed indestructible begin to crumble. After the bombardment, 6 French divisions advance behind a carefully coordinated rolling artillery barrage. Unlike earlier attacks, the creeping wall of explosions moves steadily ahead of the infantry, suppressing German defenders while protecting the advancing troops. Leading the assault are specially trained French and Senegalese colonial infantry, organized specifically for close quarters combat against heavily fortified positions. Despite fierce resistance, the attackers gradually force their way into Fort Douaumont. Months earlier, the fortress had fallen with astonishing ease. Now, reclaiming it requires one of the most carefully planned operations of the entire war. German defenders, exhausted after months of relentless fighting and demoralized by the devastating bombardment, begin surrendering in large numbers. At last, Fort Douaumont returns to French control. The surrounding villages are also recaptured, though almost nothing recognizable remains. Entire communities have been erased from the map. Where homes, churches, and roads once stood, only endless shell craters, shattered trees, and mountains of debris remain. Aerial photographs taken before and after the battle reveal an almost unimaginable transformation. The once proud fortress has become little more than a faint outline surrounded by a sea of destruction. The landscape itself appears to have been torn apart. French momentum continues. On November 2nd, German forces abandoned Fort Vaux. French troops occupy the fortress without the desperate fighting that had characterized its earlier defense. The tide has unmistakably turned. Still determined to drive the enemy farther back, Neville launches one final offensive on December 15th. Supported by overwhelming artillery, French infantry push the Germans back nearly 2 additional miles. Thousands of German soldiers are captured during the advance. Although Germany continues holding important positions such as Cape 304 and Le Mort-Homme west of the Meuse River, the eastern sector now looks remarkably similar to how it had appeared before the battle began nearly 10 months earlier. After all the bloodshed, sacrifice, and destruction, the front line has barely changed. The Battle of Verdun is finally drawing to its close. By December 1916, after more than 10 months of relentless combat, the guns around Verdun finally begin to fall silent. The city has survived. France has held its ground, but the price of victory is almost beyond comprehension. No historian can determine the exact number of casualties with complete certainty. Records from both sides remain incomplete, and countless soldiers simply disappeared beneath the endless shell fire. Most estimates place French casualties at around 377,000 men, with more than 40% either killed or missing. German losses are only slightly lower. Combined, the two armies suffer well over 700,000 casualties, including approximately 300,000 dead. For nearly 300 consecutive days, an average of 1,000 men lose their lives every single day. Yet despite this unimaginable sacrifice, neither army advances more than 5 miles from its original positions. The battlefield has become the ultimate symbol of industrialized warfare, a place where modern technology allows destruction on a scale never before imagined, while producing almost no meaningful territorial gain. From a strategic perspective, Verdun proves to be a costly failure for Germany. Erich von Falkenhayn had hoped to force France into a battle it could not afford to fight, a struggle that would bleed the French army dry and shatter its national morale. Instead, France refuses to break. General Philippe Pétain's careful defensive strategy, his innovative rotation system, and the uninterrupted flow of reinforcements along the Sacred Way allow the French army to endure months of unimaginable hardship. Ironically, Germany suffers just as severely. The enormous losses sustained at both Verdun and the Somme during 1916 permanently weakened the German army. These battles consume experienced soldiers, trained officers, artillery, and precious resources that Germany can no longer replace as easily as its enemies. Meanwhile, Britain continues expanding its military strength, while France remains determined to fight on. Before long, another major power will enter the conflict. The arrival of the United States will shift the balance even further against Germany. The Allied strategy of attrition on land and at sea gradually erodes Germany's ability to continue the war. Verdun becomes one of the defining moments in that long process. For France, however, Verdun represents something far greater than military success. It becomes a national symbol, a testament to courage, a monument to sacrifice. Above all, it honors the ordinary French infantryman, the poilu whose endurance under impossible conditions became legendary. Generation after generation, Verdun remains deeply embedded in France's national memory. Yet for many who survived, the battle represents something entirely different. Not glory, not victory, but the horrifying futility of war itself. More than a century later, visitors walking across the Verdun battlefield can still see the scars left behind. The forests conceal enormous shell craters. The ground rises and falls in unnatural ways created by millions of artillery explosions. Entire villages that once stood here were so completely destroyed that they were never rebuilt. Nature has reclaimed much of the battlefield, but the landscape still bears silent witness to one of history's greatest tragedies. Among Verdun's most moving memorials stands the Dalmont ossuary. Within its walls rest the remains of approximately 130 unidentified French and German soldiers. Their bones gathered together because they could no longer be identified individually. The memorial serves not only as a place of remembrance, but also as a powerful symbol of reconciliation between two nations that once fought with unimaginable hatred. Today, French and German leaders stand together here in peace, honoring the fallen of both armies. Few places illustrate the true cost of war more powerfully than Verdun. One of the battle's most remarkable heroes was not a general, nor even a soldier. It was a carrier pigeon named Neville. During the desperate defense of Fort Vaux, as German troops closed in and communications collapsed, Neville carried an urgent plea for reinforcements through clouds of smoke, poison gas, and exploding shells. The exhausted bird completed its mission but died shortly afterward from the effects of the toxic gas. For its extraordinary bravery, Neville was posthumously awarded the Croix de Guerre, one of France's highest military decorations. Its story serves as a reminder that throughout history, communication has often determined the outcome of war. From courageous messenger pigeons crossing battlefields to the fiber optic cables carrying information across the globe today, the methods have changed dramatically, but the importance of reliable communication has never diminished. Even after the First World War ended, Verdun continued to bear the consequences of the fighting. Large sections of the battlefield were declared part of the Zone Rouge, or red zone areas considered too dangerous for human habitation. Millions of unexploded artillery shells remained buried beneath the soil. Human remains still lay undiscovered. Chemical contamination from wartime weapons poisoned the land. Experts believed agriculture and, in some places, even permanent settlement would be impossible for generations. Many of these devastated regions were simply abandoned and left for nature to reclaim. More than 100 years later, restrictions still exist in parts of the Red Zone. Scientists continue to discover unexploded munitions, traces of toxic chemicals, and environmental damage left behind by the battle. Verdun is therefore more than a chapter in military history. It is a permanent reminder of the devastating human, environmental, and psychological cost of modern industrial warfare. Its scarred landscape stands as one of the world's most powerful memorials, a solemn warning of the terrible price humanity pays when nations choose war over peace. The Battle of Verdun did not end with a dramatic breakthrough or a decisive battlefield triumph. Instead, it ended in silence. After 10 months of relentless fighting, the guns finally ceased firing, leaving behind a landscape unlike any other in Europe. Hills had disappeared beneath millions of shell craters. Forests had been reduced to blackened stumps. Entire villages had vanished so completely that they would never be rebuilt. For the soldiers who survived, Verdun was not simply another battle. It was an experience that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Many French veterans would later say only 3 words. J'ai fait Verdun. I was at Verdun. Nothing more needed to be said. Those words alone carried the weight of unimaginable hardship, sacrifice, and endurance. Today, more than a century later, Verdun remains one of the most powerful symbols of the First World War. The battlefield still bears the scars of the conflict. Beneath its forests and fields lie countless unexploded shells, shattered fortifications, and the remains of thousands of soldiers who were never identified. At the heart of this sacred ground stands the Daumont Ossuary, where the remains of approximately 130 unidentified French and German soldiers rest together. What was once a place of hatred and destruction has become a place of remembrance and reconciliation. French and German visitors now walk the same ground in peace, honoring those who fought on both sides and remembering the terrible cost of war. Verdun also reminds us that wars leave wounds long after the shooting stops. Following the First World War, vast sections of the battlefield were designated the Zone Rouge, or red zone areas so heavily contaminated by unexploded ammunition, chemical residues, and battlefield debris that they were considered unsafe for human settlement. Even today, more than 100 years later, restrictions remain in parts of the red zone. Farmers still uncover artillery shells in their fields, while scientists continue studying the long-term environmental damage caused by one of history's most intense bombardments. Among the countless stories of courage to emerge from Verdun, one stands apart. During the desperate defense of Fort Vaux, A carrier pigeon named Neville carried a final message requesting reinforcements after every other means of communication had failed. The bird completed its mission despite flying through poison gas and relentless shell fire. It died shortly afterward from its injuries and was posthumously awarded the Croix de Guerre, becoming one of the most unlikely heroes of the battle. Its story is a reminder that throughout history, victory has depended not only on weapons and armies, but also on communication, determination, and extraordinary acts of courage. Verdun was never the largest battle of the First World War, nor was it the most decisive in purely strategic terms. Yet few battles better represent the brutal reality of industrial warfare. For 300 days, thousands of men fought over ground measured not in miles, but in yards. By the time the battle ended, nearly 300,000 soldiers had lost their lives, while hundreds of thousands more were wounded or permanently scarred. The front line had barely moved, but history had. Verdun became a symbol of French determination, a warning about the devastating cost of total war, and a lasting reminder that peace is often built upon sacrifices that should never be forgotten. More than a century later, the silent hills around Verdun continue to tell that story. Not through words, but through the scars that still remain.